I looked it up just before I hit the record button. My wife Danielle and I have been in self isolation since the 9th of March, except for a few trips to the grocery store, a few other personal errands. Danielle has been cutting flowers in her garden and delivering them to friends of ours who are shut in and to some local hospitals as well. Except for those few errands, we have been inside the four walls of our home for now more than 6 weeks. And I suspect, or I imagine that many of you watching are in the same situation. And It's the right thing to do. It's the necessary thing to do. It is a public service. If There are other people who are in a harder situation, who are obliged to work, who need to work, need to be out of their house, but the majority of Americans, as I understand it, are now inside their homes, self isolating. And look, it's not hard in the way that fighting the Revolutionary, the Civil War was hard, but it is a necessary service that you do to the public. But even as important as it is, you go a little squirrely, or at least I'm going a little squirrely. It's a little bit like we have done to each of ourselves what has collectively been done to the American economy. We put ourselves into an artificial depression. Whatever our mental outlook is, we are acting like depressive personalities. And so maybe it's not a surprise that self-inflicted depression then feeds back and actually reshapes our brain space so that even if we're not a depressive personality, we feel the way somebody in a mental depression, psychological depression feels. You get sluggish, you get stressed, your sleep becomes interrupted, you develop maybe some unhealthy habits, but you also lose a sense of purpose. So you begin with a resolution. I'm going to do all these self-improvement things. I'm going to learn to do something. I'm going to study something. I'm going to read demanding books. And then you find yourself watching television and wondering where the hours went and being very hard on yourself at the same time. And I feel that too. I mean, I felt a little bit, my impetus is flagging. I'm just going to offer this as at the beginning of this conversation before I turn to respond to reader inquiries with something that has been useful to me. And I offer this some trepidation, some modesty, but I have found many of my ambitious plans for how I would use this period of self isolation have been going awry. I've not been living up to them. But I set one small goal. I mentioned in the last YouTube conversation how much I loathe filing. And my filing system, as a result, has ended up with just in my basement, we have a storage room uh, where there were like just towers of files, towers of papers, some of them important, some of them not, that had accumulated over a long period of time. And I would open the door to that room and my heart would sink and I would close the door and the problem would only get worse. So I resolved I am going to do something about that. But I know how much I hate it. So I said, I'm not going to try to be a hero here. I'm just going to do 90 minutes a day. And I've been doing this now for about a week. And what I found is that just as depressing and dismal as it was, that, oh, and as futile and hopeless as it seemed, after doing it for 1 or 2 days, I began to notice not exactly progress, but that things at least seemed to have stopped getting worse and that the architecture of the piles did seem to be becoming more stable. And at the end of a week, I've begun to notice not order, but the possibility of order. And it's become a little bit exciting. And I will never say I look forward to this task because I do continue to hate and dread it. But I continue to apply myself. It's a very modest task, a very humdrum task, but you do have a sense of a little bit of accomplishment every day from doing that. And so, along with the other things you may be doing, I'm learning Chinese, keeping yourself fit, um, baking bread. There's a America-wide yeast shortage apparently because so many people are baking bread. Um, Modest tasks, more than ambitious ones, may be the key to mental health. But the most important key, of course, is keeping in touch with friends and family through all these amazing technologies. We have Zoom, and thank you for your queries because this is part of that process. I'm doing this for my own mental health. I hope it's useful to some of you. Thank you for your inquiries, and many people have sent more fabulous questions, and I'm going to try to answer some of them and extend a conversation with you with thanks to your attention to my work. A reader named Christian asked me, and I don't have his exact wording in front of me, but I have permission to use his name. And he said, "How do you keep track of all of the Trump scandals? Because there are so many that they almost, they almost, just remembering them, much less responding to them is so difficult. When Trumpocracy came out, one of the questions that I was asked is there anything new in this book? And I had to answer truthfully, not exactly, but a lot of it will feel new because you've forgotten it already. And when you rediscover it, you will be as shocked as you were when it happened in 2015, 2016, 2017. I think that will be the way some of you may feel about Trumpocalypse when it comes out. So here's my personal method. First, I do have a pretty good memory for these kinds of things. For many things, I have a bad memory, but for these kinds of facts and figures, I have a good memory. I also, because I mentioned before my hatred of filing, I am hopeless with keeping paper files. And one of the things I've discovered as you become more middle aged is you just have to accept your deficiencies. I have this joke I often say to my kids that when you're young, you say, I've got to be me defiantly. When you're older, you say, I've got to be me with resignation. And, there isn't, I just, maybe I'd like not to be me, but I don't see any plausible alternative to being me. So me, I have to be. So as a journalist, I've had to cope with some of the things I'm bad at by working around them. For example, I'm a really terrible interviewer. My late mother, Canadians here will know her, Barbara Frown, was one of the greatest interviewers in the history of interviewing. So I got to see how it looked when it was done well. And I'm just awful at it. And I won't go into all the self-examination as to why, but I'm just not very good at it. So over time, I learned just don't do it. That this Instead of interviewing people, use what you can do, which is I'm quite good at finding things that are written down, going through records. I'm a researcher more than I am an interviewer. So just trust that what you need to know is somewhere on the internet in a piece of paper, and go to the paper. Don't try to elicit the big reveal from the individual person. And in the same way, I don't keep filing cabinets of Trump secrets, but I do use the internet well, and I do have a system on my computer of tabulating my search results so that they're retrievable. So I rely on memory. I rely on the ability to organize computer files. Uh, and I also rely on this, that although there are a lot of Trump scandals, the president does not, in fact, have that many tricks. So once you figure out his methods, you can actually organize the scandals into a few relatively simple silos. Just to clarify what I mean about not many tricks, Vanity Fair had a story a little while ago about what they called chaos trades. They noticed that when Trump would do something that would upset financial markets, there'd be a flurry of trading activity around that. And the question was the president or were members of his family somehow trading on Trump's destructive activities? So that was an interesting question. I start with the premise that's not true, that Donald Trump is not capable of that level of criminality. Now, I don't say those trades aren't happening. It may be that he's blabbing to somebody at Mar-a-Lago who is executing the trades. But Trump's schemes are always more like smash and grab, and they're like sophisticated financial crime. Remember, Donald Trump inherited something in the order of $500 million. All he had to do was keep that money, and he wasn't able to do that. All he had to do was not do dumb things, and he would be one of the richest people in the United States, thanks to the legacy from his late father. So if you can't re- avoid frittering away a $500 million fortune, you're probably not someone who's capable of highly sophisticated financial frauds. You're going to do petty financial frauds, Trump University, Trump Stakes, the multi-level Trump marketing of the Trump online businesses. And that's sort of my assumption about where he is. So knowing that he's got these few tricks, I'm able, when I come across one of them, to sort it into one of the mental file folders of Trump type criminality, and also to have a good sense of what is not Trump type criminality. A reader who goes by the name of, or by the tag of K Geographer asked, there's a, I'm recording this on a day when Brit Hume and William Kristol had a kind of Twitter argument about what Bill Kristol called Trump's performative authoritarianism. President Trump makes these huge claims for his own authority. I can do anything. I control all the governors. He's, of course, too lazy and incompetent actually to act on it. And the question is, do these outrageous claims that the president makes matter? And Brit Hume, who, when all of this is over, Brit Hume will deny that he ever supported Donald Trump. He belongs to that category of people, I think it will say. I was never for him. I just was upset about media bias. That's what I was talking about, but they are for him. Um, Bridham made the point, well, if Trump doesn't follow through on this performative authoritarianism, why should anybody be worried about it? And Bill Kristol, in my view, correctly said, it's alarming, even if the president doesn't act on it. And it's alarming for a couple of reasons. And I'm on the Kristol side of this debate. It's alarming first because when the president stakes these claims, whatever you think of the president, whatever the president's competencies, the president is surrounded by people who, for their own reasons, want to support him, want to make his words true. He gives permissions to people to act in certain kinds of ways, and not just in the future, but now. More ruthless, sharper allies of his in governors' mansions or in the Senate, who may try to make a reality of the things that he says. But even if he fails totally, the president of the United States, his or her most important asset is the language that they use. Compared to, say, a British prime minister, an American president is not the most powerful chief executive in the democratic world. What an American president has that no other chief executive in the democratic world has is a level of authority. Because a president is kind of like an elected monarch. He's the head of state, or she is the head of state, as well as the head of government. If the president speaks carelessly or throws a lot of empty language, they are laying waste to one of the most important legacies and powers of the presidency, which is precisely the ability to speak. And if the president speaks in ways that make people afraid of the presidency, afraid of the federal government, or worse, or as bad, but I would say worse, contemptuous of or disrespectful of their national government, of the institutions of the state, that's a harm too. Trump's habit of saying things that don't mean anything is also dangerous, both because those things do sometimes become realities. A lot of Trump's craziest ideas have a way of becoming true, and I've written a lot about that. But even if they don't, what he has done is thrown away an important legacy that wasn't his to throw away. Another reader with the Twitter handle OFFS, whatevs, and I have permission to use this, has asked, "Hi, David. I think we can take it as a given that Trump's reputation among presidential scholars of the future will be that he was one of the 3 or 4 worst presidents in history. My question is, do you think he'll be regarded as merely one of the worst or as literally the worst of the presidents the U.S. has had up to this point in history? Is it possible he will be considered worse than Johnson and Buchanan, or is that a bridge too far?" And then there's a follow-up question. And if you have the time, here's another question I had on the opposite end of the scale. Who do you think are the 3 greatest presidents in U.S. history, excluding Lincoln, Washington, and the 2 Roosevelts? So that is that's a question really worth thinking about. As bad as what we're living through is, it doesn't obviously compare to the Civil War. So the presidents who before 1860 failed to avert or accelerated the Civil War, they have done more damage than Donald Trump has yet done. But here's a couple of ways to think about it that maybe are useful. The first is, as a human being, I think Donald Trump is the worst person ever to hold the office of the presidency, and I include all the slaveholders, because even the others who are bad human beings, you can identify some kind of redeeming quality, like Franklin Pierce and John Tyler before the Civil War. I mean, Tyler sat in the Confederate Congress. He was a traitor to the United States, and he was a quarrelsome and difficult person and smashed the Whig Party. Franklin Pierce was an alcoholic, but both of them were, in their private capacities, quite attractive human beings. And they're both very affectionate fathers, for example. Andrew Johnson and Andrew Jackson, Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's successor, and also with a drinking problem. But Johnson was incredibly physically brave. He had been a brave to the peril of his life Union governor of Tennessee during the Civil War. Andrew Jackson, of course, was incredibly personally brave. Donald Trump doesn't have any of those merits. James Buchanan, often rated the worst president of the United States. He was a diplomat. He was well-traveled. He was well-informed. Richard Nixon, a profound and supple intellect. Warren Harding, fun at a party. Donald Trump just has no amiable qualities at all. Now, we measure presidents, I think, more by their effect. And so that's one of the reasons why some of the early the pre-1860 presidents get kind of a pass. They seemed kind of inadequate people, but it was also not that big a job. I think we also there's a kind of cunning of history that even people who get reviled, you know, uh, I think it was Millard Fillmore who signed the Compromise of 1850, which created a federal fugitive slave act, and so he gets a lot of bad press for that because before 1850, apprehending enslaved persons as they tried to make their way northward or to Canada for freedom, that was a job for the states. After 1850, the U.S. government would reach into places like Boston and Buffalo and seize former slaves and capture them and return them southward. And Fillmore signed the law that made that possible, which seems a pretty horrible thing to do. But the Compromise of 1850 postponed the Civil War for 10 years. Had the Civil War happened in 1850, the South would have won. By postponing it to 1860, Fillmore, he didn't know he was doing this, but he made possible 10 years of industrial expansion in the North, 10 years of railway laying that ensured that when the war did come in 1861, the North had the strength to win. Of the modern presidents, I think Trump's absence of positive achievement and the terrible legacy he's leaving behind certainly rate him among the very worst. But I think what human beings or Americans of the future will remember is just the kind of person he was and the example he set and the way he talked. And we're never going to efface that stain. I remember visiting the Reagan Library around the time that Donald Trump was elected president. And there's a long, windy road up to the mountain peak where the Reagan Library is. And there are fluttering banners of all the presidents from Washington to Reagan and beyond. And at that point, there was not a ban. Reagan, I should say, the former president. So Reagan, so the Reagan Library, Donald Trump's picture wasn't hanging yet, but someday it will because you don't omit people. We're not like the ancient Egyptians where they would sandblast away or chisel out the images of offending pharaohs. He'll be in our history. He will never not be the president of the United States, and we'll all have to live with that. Greatest presidents, excluding Lincoln, Washington, and the two Roosevelts. That's a more contentious question. I admire. I think one of our biases in judging people in politics is we give a lot of credit for the good things that people do and not enough for the bad things that they prevent. So a president like the elder George Bush, who was there during the peaceful unification of Germany. We just now take all that for granted. And we don't think enough about the many ways that it could have gone wrong because it didn't go wrong. But it didn't go well automatically. There were a lot of ways that it could go wrong. And I think George H.W. Bush's reputation is going to shine brighter and brighter. Incredible environmental accomplishments like doing the negotiations with Canada that effectively ended the problem of acid rain. He was the president who advocated for and then signed the Americans with Disabilities Act that has been such a powerful force of bringing so many people who would once have been excluded from access to commerce and the mainstream of American life into the center of American life. And of course, the liberation of Kuwait and the amazingly successful end of the Cold War and the long period of stability we got as a result of that. That was a great accomplishment. My friend Josh Marshall makes a point that you should think of President Polk as one of the most successful. That he, in his inaugural address, laid out three things he wanted to do. Wanted to annex Texas. He wanted to. He had a complicated workaround for the banking system of the United States. I'm now going to forget what the third thing he wanted was. He said he would serve one term. He did those three things. He served the one term. He left office, and then he immediately died. So bang, 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 dead. Great accomplishment. Polk had some moral defect. He was an enthusiastic slaveholder, which is part of the record too. But I want to say one last word for somebody who, since I was allowed three, I think we need to think about, especially people like me need to think about more, and that is President Eisenhower. That we have written a history of the Republican Party in which Reagan is the symbol and Eisenhower is regarded as this background figure. And I think that as post-Trump Republicans try to reclaim a usable history for the Republican Party, figures like Eisenhower and Ford and the elder Bush, they're going to have to be reclaimed. And Reagan gets a very high place in American history, to my way of thinking, but making him not only the center but the entirety of the Republican experience in the United States um, uh, damages damages the possibility of a forward-looking conservatism in this country. What else have I got here? Uh, Tim Parker, a reader named Tim Parker, I have permission to use his name, asked a question about the central, how important do I think campaign finance reform is? So I'm going to say something that marks me out a little bit with at a difference with the views of some of the people who read my work. I am a campaign finance skeptic, and I'm inspired here by a story that Daniel Patrick Moynihan tells about the bust of the French Connection. So Moynihan was the first drug czar back in the early 1970s under President Nixon. And he was on the job when the United States intercepted the big mound of heroin in Marseille that became the basis for the movie The French Connection. So when this achievement became known in Washington, obviously people were tremendously excited, and Moynihan, who had presided over it, wanted to tell President Nixon about it. And he caught an early helicopter out of the White House to Camp David to brief the president in person. And Moynihan tells the story in one of his memoirs. And he got in the helicopter and you put on the headphones so you could communicate over the noise with the other people in the helicopter. He became aware that George Shultz, who I think at that time was Secretary of Labor, was in the helicopter with him. And Moynihan couldn't restrain himself, so he just burbled his enthusiasm. George, you won't believe what we've done. And he told him. And Shultz, who was reading the Wall Street Journal, folded down in a corner of the paper, absorbed the news, and said, great, congratulations, and put the paper back up and returned to reading, obviously utterly unimpressed. Moynihan said, no, you don't understand, George. This is the largest drug bust in American history. It was so difficult, and we're going to send a lot of people to prison. It's just a huge thing. And Shultz remained uninterested. And as Moynihan processed this wound to his ego, he realized before entering government, Shultz had been a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. And Moynihan said, George, I imagine you think that so long as there's a demand for drugs in the United States, there will be a supply of them into the United States. And Shultz now closed the newspaper, interested for the first time, and said, there may be hope for you after all. So here's how I think about campaign finance reform. Many liberals look at the concentration of wealth and power in the United States and its effect in politics. I think if only there was some way of cutting the flow of this concentrated wealth into politics, we would have a political system more independent of wealthy people than we do now. And I think that is in a way naive, that so long as you have these giant concentrations of wealth, they are going to have political power. And if you attempt to control that through the campaign finance system, all you do is empower lawyers and accountants to come up with ingenious ways to sluice the money from the people into whose hands it is concentrating into the political system to the politicians who want to spend it. The problem is not the flow of money. The problem is the concentration of money. And so long as that money is so concentrated, I don't think there are campaign finance rules that you can write that are going to prevent the money flowing from the few who have so much into politics to bend the political system to the will of the few. That campaign finance reform is a political solution to a social and economic problem. I don't think it's going to work. I don't think the answer lies in that direction. And then here's a last question I'll take today. I have many versions of this question, but I was going to talk about a couple of books. I'm not going to talk about Station 11 today because there isn't time. I do want to talk about this book, which is a history of the influenza epidemic of 1918, Pale Rider by Laura Spinney. There are a number of books about the influenza epidemic. There's one that greatly influenced the second President Bush called simply The Great Influenza. To my way of thinking, if you're reading one, this is the one to read because, well, for many reasons, but starting, it puts the influenza epidemic of 1918 into a truly global perspective. It doesn't treat it just as something that happened in American cities or on the battlefield of Europe. The vast majority of the people who died in 1918 were neither Americans nor Europeans. It had global effects, and it needs to be understood that way. And while The Great Influenza, the book that was released a decade before this, that had a lot of influence on people, it tends to tell the 1918 story in a heroic way, focusing on the American doctors who tried to understand the disease and to limit it. But 1918 is not a success story. The doctors failed. And the attempt to recast it as a story of the triumph of medicine over disease is not, I think it's not truthful and it's not helpful. So I found this, if you're reading one, this is the one to read. But that wasn't the question from the reader. The question was, this is from a reader in Denmark. We have a lockdown here too. What are your recommendations for 3 eye-opening and entertaining books about the world, humanity, history to read during social distancing? So if you're looking for things that are really ambitious, because you may be cooped up for months, here are, actually, I'm going to use four books that have been very influential on my way of thinking about a lot of issues, and they're heavy. So I recommend them with care, because you may not want to finish them all. You may not want to even try to lift them all. But here are 4 books that I've recently read that have had a big impact on my thinking. The first is a book called Escape from Rome by a historian named Walter Scheidel. The title sounds a little sensational, but this is not a sensational book. The question that Walter Scheidel starts with is, if you looked at the world in the year 200 of the Common Era, you saw big empire governing all of Western Europe and the Mediterranean basin, the Roman Empire. There were big empires gathered in the Indian subcontinent, and there was, of course, the Han Chinese Empire. And there would eventually be, in time, substantial empires in West Africa. There would, in time, be substantial empires in Mesoamerica. Empires come and go, but in most of the world, when an empire fell, it tended to be reconstituted. So the Han Empire falls apart, but China has been governed by some form of unified state system for almost all of its history. And it will occasionally break up into pieces, but then be put back together again. And India, not until the British came did anybody have the entire Indian subcontinent under one regime. But through most of Indian history, big parts of the Indian continent have been under a single government. Western African empires have been a little less stable, but they too tend to show up and based typically on the same river systems. And in Mesoamerica, that before the Aztecs, there were other large, not as ambitious and powerful as the Aztecs, but other large forms. Only in Europe, when the Roman Empire fell, did it never get put back together again. So Scheidel tries to answer, why did all the attempts to reunify Europe and the Mediterranean after Rome, why did they fail? And what consequences has that had for world history? And it's a very thought-provoking book. The failure to put the Roman Empire together guaranteed that Europe would be the seat of highly competitive governments, small governments, each holding small areas of territory, all in competition one with the other. And that has had consequences, some of them positive. Those governments then had to compete for wealth and influence. That meant they experimented with a lot of different ways of mobilizing national power, one of which became what we would know as liberalism and democracy. When the Dutch and the British in the 17th century began developing what we called liberalism and democracy, it wasn't to be nice, it was to be more effective in fighting the French. But along the way, they discovered they had unleashed a creative dynamic in human existence that was truly new. It also meant that the European states developed an expertise in making war, one upon the other, that then allowed them to carry European power all over the world. The Chinese state never developed the kind of aggressive ability to project power that its wealth and size would think, because they didn't need to. On one side they have the Himalayas, on the other side they have the ocean. Below them they have jungle and a lot of very small kingdoms, and above them they have the problem of dealing with nomadic raiders, and that is their number one security threat. They're focused on that entirely, which is why the wealth of China tended to be in the south, but the capital was usually in the north. But the nomads never had new military technology, so the Chinese didn't need to come up with new military technologies either. In Europe, the French and the Spanish and the Dutch and the different German principalities and the British, or the English before them, they were always fighting with each other, and so they had to come up with new naval techniques and mobilize gunpowder through the new technologies of drill. And they then developed military excellence that allowed them, when they began to expand beyond Europe, to overwhelm the world and reshape the world as we know it. So Scheidele's book has had a lot of influence on my thinking. A book that is unfortunately very timely right now is William McNeill's Plagues and People, which is a history of the world from an epidemiological point of view. It's an older book, I think published in the 1970s, so it's not completely up to date with all of the latest work on epidemic of the kind that Laura Spinney uses in Pale Rider, but the main concepts stand the test of time. McNeill envisioned human history as a story of individual people trapped between two layers of parasite. Pathogens below them and states above them, both of which try to extract things from human beings. Pathogens don't want to kill you, because if the human being dies, so does the host of the pathogen. The pathogen is looking to batten on the human being, but to keep the human being alive long enough that the pathogen can spread to its next host. And states in the same way, states that annihilate the people they rule, like the Stalinist state, or they doom themselves because they take too much. And the story of humanity becomes, as human communities interconnect, that these pathogens, which in the earliest days of humanity were trapped into small pools of humanity, are able to spread wider and wider until we have finally, the most famous connection is this disastrous contact between Europe and the indigenous peoples of the Americas in the 16th century. But humanity is now one disease pool, and one instantaneous. We've been a single disease pool for a while. That's how the Spanish flu, as it was so called, spread around the world. We are now one instantaneous disease pool, where a human being can move around from one side of the planet to the other in 24 hours, taking whatever pathogens that person is carrying. And McNeill's story of that integrates the disease into the story of the development of human civilization, timely and thought-provoking. Another book that's had, this is again an ambitious book that's had a lot of impact on my thinking in recent years, is a book by a military historian named Geoffrey Parker called The General Crisis of the 17th Century. So that title is not very sensational, but most of us know two things about the 17th century. There were a lot of wars, and it was very cold. And Parker puts those two elements together into a story of the impact of climate change on human civilization. That the world gets gradually cooler from 1590, or the Northern Hemisphere, I should say, gets gradually cooler from 1590 to 1620. And then suddenly between 1620 and 1630 gets dramatically cooler. And the result is catastrophe across the planet. The Ming Dynasty in China collapses and is replaced amid terrible human suffering. Empires fall in India and in Poland. There's civil wars in Hungary. There's the British Civil War. There's the 30 Years' War in Central Europe, the most disastrous conflict on the European conflict from the fall of Rome to 1914. And all of them are connected and made worse by climactic crisis. The really frightening thing about the climate crisis, as Geoffrey Parker describes it, is how suddenly it arrived. As I say, you got 30 years to get used to it gradually. So if you're young in 1590, by 1620, you notice the winters are definitely more severe and the summers are a little bit drier than they were when you remembered. And then suddenly, bango, you're off the cliff into a kind of mini ice age. And then it begins to change for the better around the year 1700, 1710, and by the 18th century, humanity is out of it. The suddenness with which climates can be put into disequilibrium is something really to think about. When we think about climate now, we argue, is the climate changing? I think that argument is over. Is it human-made? I think that argument is largely over. Can we adapt to it? That argument is not over. When the people who say we can adapt to it think we're going to have time, that it will be a gradual slope. That may not be the case. The world got warmer and warmer through the 1990s. It came to a kind of peak in 1998. And then from 1998 to 2012, the warming process seemed to stop. And a lot of people would say, well, this is over. Then it resumed again in 2012, and this time resumed faster. I think, as with the pandemic should teach us, we may have less time than we think. And that is certainly the lesson of Geoffrey Parker. One thing to consider, one criticism of the book is Parker, in the study of the 17th century, treats the climate change at that time as something that is non-human made, that is something that is the sunspots or whatever external force changed the climate of the Earth. It was not a human action. There's been some research since he wrote his book to suggest that actually the cooling of the 17th century was human made. The encounter between Europeans and indigenous people in the New World killed so many people, killed so many indigenous people from disease, that vast areas of what is now Mexico, what is now Peru, what is now the United States, that had been under cultivation reverted to forest. And the rise of these of trees that sucked carbon out of the air were one of the important causes of the cooling of the world in the early 17th century. So it may have been human made, inadvertently human made, but human made after all. Last candidate, and this is, I'm going to cheat because this is actually two books by the same author, and the author is Adam Tooze, who's written two books about the economy of the 20th century, one about the Nazi war economy called Wages of Destruction, and the other about the First World War called The Deluge. And there are many fascinating things to say about these two books, or many fascinating things in the two books that I can comment on. But the one that I take away as of enduring value is that Tooze is fabulously interesting on the inherent power of the Anglo-American world, the British Empire plus the United States plus the other English-speaking countries, that was hidden by the Great Depression in the 1930s, and it was this hiding of American and British power that invited Hitler into the delusion that Germany could make itself master of Europe and then master of the world. The world system that Tooze describes is morally complicated. Power is never exercised innocently in this guilty world. But for those of us who value a world in which goods and services are exchanged freely, in which more and more of us have more and more of the rights of liberty and democracy, that world is something precious and to be protected. And he, again, a lot of insights into the world of the first half of the 20th century, but also a lot of insights into what in the 21st century, at least I, speaking just for myself, think is worth protecting. Thank you. I'm going to pause there. I've talked for a long time. I'm not used to talking this long, especially in these days of silent walls. One last thing I want to say. As some of you may know, my wife Danielle, she records a podcast called The Femsplainers. I recommend it to you. They released today an installment with the very interesting and independent-minded writer Katie Roiphe, who's written a book about women in difficult relationships. And Danielle and she talked a little bit about the comparative value to human creativity of the difficult relationship versus the more stable relationship. And I think all of us who are with another person in these times of isolation find ourselves thinking more and more about how relationships and how they go. And one practical thought I have to offer as I finish this off, aside from catching up with your filing if you've fallen behind, is one of the things that I have been a huge beneficiary of is Danielle starts every morning. It's the first thing she says when she wakes up in the morning. The first things that word out of her mouth is something warm and loving and affectionate. And just that, I'm usually up before her. That first instant of the day sets the tone for the whole day. It makes, she invites me to think how to be a better person, how to be a better partner to her. And the whole day is just warmer. And I think as we are all at close quarters, I mean, one of the just that first warm word and just trying to do it again during the day, that's if we can do it, if we feel motivated to it, and even if we don't entirely feel motivated to it, what a difference that can make in all lives, not only of the two of you, but of everybody around you. I wish you well through the difficult times. It looks like there's going to be more of this. If you're interested, I will try to record some more of these. And I thank you for your attention. I thank you for your attention to my work, and what a pleasure it is to talk. Thank you for your questions.